Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of How to Live Well and Thrive with Parkinson's Disease. We are so happy to have everyone back and to be rounding out our 3-day webinar. Dr. Shah is just going to be a little bit late, so she'll be joining us soon. So I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. And we're going to be starting with Elizabeth Delaney. Elizabeth is a social worker. You heard a little bit from her yesterday at Columbia University. And she's going to be starting off talking about providing holistic care and some work about how to overcome challenges and things related to care partner needs. So Elizabeth, we're so happy to have you.
Thanks, Lori. And I will also mention that in this section coming up, I have Marcia Deer with me as well, and she's a insurance healthcare navigator. So as we all know, insurance can certainly be a barrier when we're trying to get treatment or services for those with Parkinson's. So we did want to address what those barriers could be, and also how does one go about getting health care coverage, because that's important as well. So Lori, if you could advance the slide. Mm-hmm. So we're actually going to start with Marcia. So I'll pass it to her and she's going to talk about health insurance, and then I will go ahead and discuss what are some limitations of insurance when it comes to care for those with Parkinson's. So I'll pass it along.
Hi, good night. My name is Marcia Deer. I'm an associate director at the Linkage for Insurance for the Alliance for Positive Change. If you're not familiar with the Alliance, let me briefly describe what we do and why we do it. For nearly 30 years, Alliance has been a community of transformation and opportunity created by, with, and for low-income New Yorkers living with HIV and other chronic disease conditions. We are a leading multi-service provider. We build opportunity and belonging by providing access to quality health care, mental health support, housing, harm reduction, substance use treatment, and path to jobs or renowned peer training program cultivate leadership and economic mobility. Since our founding days, we have recognized the racial, social, and economic inequities affect every dimension of our community's health, and this has never been more apparent in recent memory than the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had the people we serve. In my role, I'm equipped to assist uninsured New Yorkers with information they need and help them navigate systemic barriers to health and well-being. That includes assessing health insurance through the marketplace. Enrollment takes about 30 minutes and eligibility is determined at the end of enrollment unless additional documents are requested. Insurance eligibility is determined based on income provided in the application. Applicants merely submit financial information and proof of immigration status. All documents stay confidential within the marketplace. They are not shared with any other agency. If someone does not have documentation, they are still entitled to emergency Medicaid. Immigrants are eligible for essential plan with proof of valid visa or I-94 arrival departure. Our team provides assistance over the phone, giving insight into appropriate health insurance options, and we can offer bilingual assistance. Groups ineligible are Medicare recipients who don't have a child under the age of 18 years, and consumers over 65, they can benefit from the advanced tax credit included in the 2021 American Rescue Plan, which lowered the cost of health insurance coverage and broadened the eligibility for financial assistance to help pay for coverage through the federal marketplace, which provided the people we serve with greater security to step forward and access care.
Thank you, Marcia. And I will say we do have a, well, actually, Lori, could you go back to that last slide? Yeah, we do have a document called Navigating the Healthcare Marketplace. And I think it's important that if you don't have healthcare coverage, that you do get connected to a navigator such as Ms. Deer, who can help you figure out what you're eligible for and help you enroll in that specific plan. So now that we know a little bit about how to get healthcare coverage, I'm going to talk a little bit about certain services that you might find a roadblock to when it comes to different types of insurances. So I'll start with one of the biggest issues that I see is long-term care. So many of our patients have Medicare or they have private insurance plans through their employer. And it's important to note that most private plans and Medicare or Medicare Advantage plans do not cover long-term care. So they were never meant to be long-term care insurance. So when we're looking at home care or long-term care services, whether that be help in the home or facility-based care, the question is, how is it covered then if Medicare or my insurance that I have now does not cover it? So there are long-term care insurance policies out there. So when I find someone that has that, it's kind of shocking because many don't invest in that sort of policy. But if you do have that, they cover a lot of long-term care services, including help in the home or adult day programs or facility-based care. If you're a veteran, you might be eligible for VA benefits, and they do actually provide coverage for both in-home care and facility-based care. Medicaid is another way in which long-term care services are covered, and of course, privately paying for home care. So if you have Medicare, does it cover anything in regards to home care? And the answer is yes. Again, not long-term, but there is short-term coverage. And there are certain requirements that need to be met in order to get home care services through Medicare or any private plan. So the first criteria is that the person is considered homebound, and that just means that it takes great effort, or it's very difficult to leave the home. And that means that you wouldn't also be able to go outpatient for rehab services. There also needs to be a skilled service need in the home. So Medicare and most insurances won't just cover a home health aide or personal care attendant on its own. You would need to have a skilled service in the home. And that means nursing care. So something like wound care, could be physical, occupational, or speech therapy services. And if you need those, we can refer you for that. And then we can ask for an aide as well. To initiate a referral for home care services through Medicare or any other insurance plan, we also need a visit in the last 90 days. I think that might be actually specific to Medicare. Some insurance plans might not require that, but they do need a face-to-face visit, and that can actually be virtual in order to initiate home care services through Medicare. But it is important to note again, although they do provide some coverage, it's short-term in nature. So I usually see it lasting 5 to 6 weeks at a time. And I kind of equate it to if someone were to go to the hospital, have a hip surgery, be sent home, they're sent home with these services and an aide, physical therapy, with the expectation that they return to some sort of level of independent functioning. But that, of course, isn't very helpful when we are dealing with someone that has a progressive neurological condition. So that's kind of it for home care services or services in the home. So what about skilled nursing facilities or rehab care? So what Medicare covers in regards to that, they actually do cover up to 100 days for an episode of illness in a skilled nursing facility or a rehab center. In order to get those services, you actually do need to have a hospital admission stay of at least 3 days. And observation stay does not count. Any days that you're there for observation would not count towards those 3 days. Medicare will cover the first 20 days of that skilled nursing or rehab visit in full. And then the following 21 to 100 days, there would actually be a daily copayment if you have Medicare. And I think in 2020, that number was $176 per day that you were there after that first 20 days. Outside of skilled nursing facilities, you may have heard of assisted living facilities and independent living facilities. These types of facilities are not covered by Medicare. So I did mention before that Medicaid does cover some of these long-term care services. So it covers in-home care up to 24/7, although that's sometimes really hard to get. But as we all know, or maybe we don't know, but sorry, I got a message from yeah, so along with the skilled nursing and rehab stays, sorry, I got a question. I could certainly speak to that in this part. Those that are interested in doing some sort of inpatient rehab stay. So if you're finding that you need more than you're getting from your outpatient rehab therapist, and you think maybe a short-term rehab stay would be helpful to you, that is an option, but the way to access that can be a little bit difficult. I am a social worker in the community, so I see a lot of patients that aren't in the hospital currently. And it is very difficult because there are certain evaluations that need to be done to be admitted to the skilled nursing or rehab facility that are hard to get in the community. You have to pay out of pocket for them. They might expire before you are up on the wait list to be admitted to the rehab stay. So there are a lot of obstacles to getting into an inpatient rehab from the community. So what I suggest for people that are finding that they do really want or they need that more intensive acute or subacute rehab care is I do advise them to go to the hospital, as I mentioned before, for that 3-day admission. It's much easier of a process to get someone from hospital into a rehab facility than from community. So I do recommend, if you find that you really do want that a subacute or acute rehab, then to go to the hospital and say that you're not thriving at home as you wish you would be. You need the rehab more than is offered in outpatient setting, and then kind of advocate for yourself and advocate for your loved one or the person with Parkinson's, that they do need to stay there for 3 days and not be sent straight back home, but rather to a rehab facility. So I hope that answered that question. So back to kind of Medicaid in terms of what that covers, because that is another option if you don't have a long-term care insurance policy, you're not eligible for VA benefits. It is an income-based insurance. And so there is a limit to how much you are receiving in income, and there's a limit to how many assets you can have. So I think the most recent limits were for a single individual, 10,000 for New York, because Medicaid is a state-run program. It differs state to state. For an individual, I think this year or last year was 10,500 in income, and then about 15,000 in assets. So if you were above that, you technically wouldn't be eligible for Medicaid. However, a lot of our patients and people that we see fall in between that being eligible for Medicaid, but also not being able to afford privately all this care that they need. And in those instances, I usually recommend that they reach out to an elder law attorney for Medicaid planning. And these elder law attorneys would be able to kind of assess your financial picture, your assets, and rearrange things in a way that makes a person eligible for Medicaid. Then they could apply, and then they could access a lot of the benefits that Medicaid has. I put avo.com here. It's a search engine for attorneys. You can actually filter by zip code and also by if they do elder law or Medicaid planning. So that's one way to find an elder law attorney. Of course, there is a cost associated with getting that service, but I always encourage people to kind of weigh what the cost would be to get Medicaid and have an attorney versus if you did need a lot of care in the home and paying for it privately, would that kind of outweigh it. And there's also, in New York at least, the New York Legal Assistance Group also helps with providing attorneys and help with accessing these different types of benefits. And so now that's kind of it for long-term care. And I say it, even though that's a lot of information, but hopefully that gave you enough insight to see how it could be a little bit difficult to access long-term care, but there are solutions and ways to do that. So now moving on to medications. So of course, another challenge in which insurance sometimes either A, doesn't cover the medication that one is prescribed by their movement disorder specialist, or the copayment associated with that medication is too high to kind of keep that treatment ongoing. So in those instances, there are some resources out there that may help. The first is a website called needymeds.org. And you can actually type in the name of the medication that you have been prescribed or that is too costly for you. And they might actually have a patient assistance or prescription assistance program. So that means most of them are usually income-based and or based on what type of insurance you already have. But you might, what I suggest is apply because you never know if you're approved. And if you do get approved for some of these prescription assistance programs, the cost of the medication may be covered completely, or it might be like a $10 payment, something probably a lot less than what your copayment has been. And in addition to needymeds.org, there's an organization or a foundation called Patient Access Network. And they actually have different disease funds in which you can apply and get cash assistance with medication costs. So they have a disease fund specific to Parkinson's that would provide roughly $3,000 a year for medication costs related to Parkinson's. And I have had patients, I think this resource was actually given to me by a patient who had been approved for the $3,000, and then they had money left over in their fund for that year and got approved for a little bit more too because they needed that assistance. So that's another resource that I think is super helpful and that I would kind of jot down too. Okay, so then in terms of rehab services, there are of course challenges to accessing that, especially for physical, occupational, and speech therapy services. So what does Medicare cover? It does cover rehab services on an outpatient basis, but there are yearly thresholds. And so they used to be limits and caps, but now there are thresholds that once they're met, you kind of have to prove medical necessity or need for anything beyond that threshold. So for 2021, just for example, Medicare's threshold for physical and speech therapy, because those two services are lumped together, was roughly $2,100. And then for occupational therapy, which is separate, it was another $2,100. So once that threshold is reached, then it would be necessary to review the referral, to review the necessity of that service. So one way to or a few ways to get around this issue, you can try to work with your rehab specialist to either maybe get more sessions, and usually what we do from the movement disorder specialist side is maybe write a letter of medical necessity to try and help with that request for more services. You might also work with your rehab specialist to spread your visits throughout the year so that you're not reaching that threshold early on and kind of stuck for a little bit. So spreading it out throughout the year, coming up with a good plan. Or since they do group physical and speech therapy separate from occupational therapy, if you use up your physical therapy allotment or threshold, then you could maybe go into OT because there is some overlap there. So that's another way to still be active in your rehab if you already reach your physical therapy threshold. And of course, supplementing with free community resources as well in terms of health and wellness programs. There are a lot of virtual Parkinson's exercise programs now. A lot of what I usually recommend is tapping into your local seniors or community center. A lot of senior centers have health and wellness programs that are free to members of the community. A lot of them have like yoga, Tai Chi, dance. And so you could supplement your physical therapy as you spread them out in between your sessions, finding a good workout regimen, including some of those programs that are local to you and your senior center as well. And then I just also did want to touch on medical equipment. So for medical equipment, for Medicare, I usually talk about Medicare because that's what a lot of our patients have, but for Medicare, it doesn't cover certain like bathroom equipment. So like shower chairs, for instance, aren't really covered, but they can be bought privately or through online or Amazon, whatever it might be. And then Medicare does not cover any sort of home modifications. So if you're looking for a stair lift, if you're looking for to get ramps installed, or you're trying to modify your bathroom so you have a walk-in shower as opposed to a tub, those would be considered home modifications by Medicare and not medical equipment, and so they wouldn't be covered. But it is important to note that Medicaid will cover some of these services that aren't covered by Medicare as well. In addition to the home care services, some of the equipment would be covered, as well as a long-term care policy might cover some of these modifications to make the home safer and more accessible. And, you know, Medicare is kind of a big kind of umbrella term because there are Advantage plans. So you can either get an Medicare Advantage plan, which is called Part C, or you can get a supplemental. And that would cover either like co-payments, or they might cover a little bit more than your traditional Medicare would cover. So I don't know everything about every insurance plan. So I always advise patients to check with your insurance plan to see what benefits you are eligible for, what is covered. And maybe even requesting like a benefits guide so that you can kind of look through what services, what equipment is covered, and know that you have that at your reach, and then asking them how you can access those things, usually with a referral or some sort of medical note to get those. I did see some questions, but that was the end of this section, and I'm happy to answer questions now, or if we wanted to hold off. Yeah. I don't know, I see the chat, so I'm just trying to review that quickly.
Liz, while you read that, I just got a quick question, because I know this was mostly about kind of the allied health professional and other resources, but maybe could you touch on, you know, if someone on this call or otherwise is looking to identify a neurologist, like how might they go about doing that?
Sure. So what I would recommend to start with is like going through Parkinson's Foundation or APDA, the American Parkinson's Disease Association, and seeing if there's either a center of excellence near you. I think there's also like a movement disorder specialist search that you could do by zip code. That's kind of what I would recommend. But if, of course, you know, they might need to be close to a center of excellence or a movement disorder specialist, then I would say, I usually always tend to go more hospital-based or someone that's more affiliated with a medical center, just because you'll also have those other resources available like rehab and any other kind of department a hospital might have, rather than like, unless they're movement disorder specialist, someone that's kind of privately on their own, because you might have more difficulty building that network for your medical team.
Yeah, and I might just add to that in terms of, so I think those are definitely the ways that I would start as well, or suggest to a family member or friend if they're looking to identify someone. But, you know, we mentioned how folks might be engaged with a support group or other patient advocates. So those tend to be really good resources for, you know, they might give you a personal recommendation or have a sense of how to, that, you know, this is someone that I've met and I think you would fit well with. Also, you might ask your primary care provider, who typically knows you very well, if they have a specific referral. But then I would also just encourage the participants to be empowered that if you do meet a neurologist or a movement disorder specialist and it doesn't happen to be a good fit for you, you feel that your communication isn't, styles don't mesh, just recognize that it's okay to you know, find someone different or ask for a second opinion. I would say though, you know, I do run into some people that also do, you know, have seen every specialist in New York City, have gone to Mount Sinai, NYU, Columbia, Cornell. And I think that there may be a reason for that. And I think it may be that they're searching for that connection. But I think sometimes that also can be very burdensome for both the care partner and the person with Parkinson's to just have all of these doctor's visits and get a lot of information and be overwhelmed by that. So I would just suggest that it might be worth taking the extra time to research and find who you might be a better fit, rather than just having a series of appointments to try to interview doctors, to find a good provider. Because I think that can also be honestly confusing, because people do have a slightly different take. The way I've explained things may be correct and accurate, but someone else might explain it slightly differently. And that doesn't mean their approach or my approach is wrong, but it's just a different flavor. So just another thought that I wanted to share.
But can I share, like on the marketplace, we do have a whole variety of providers that we assist our clients as well. Like just today, a lady called me. She told me she lives in Queens, and she asked, if I could find a provider to match her insurance. And I went online and I found a couple of providers. I said, I don't know your match, but these are your options. Call, see if it's. And we do, because the marketplace do have a lot of providers. So you just put in the zip code, and you ask the clients, where do you want to have the provider? And you put in the zip code and you assist them sometimes. So we do that sometime as well.
And Liz, I don't know if you saw this comment from Nettie Harper, who's saying that it might be helpful to share how to get linked with a social worker.
Sure. Yeah. So I've gotten this question before too. And for a lot of outpatient movement disorder centers, I think if they're affiliated with a Parkinson's Foundation or American Parkinson's Disease Association, it's likely that they'll either have a social worker or a center coordinator, which would be someone that they could go to help them through the process. If someone's not connected to like a center of excellence or something like that, or there's not a social worker at your neurologist office, I do recommend, well, there's a private pay option where you can get a geriatric care manager who would be like a me, but outside in the community, not just in the doctor's office, who could help navigate a lot of these sometimes complicated issues. Or sometimes, especially for Medicaid, there are, I know in New York, I'm more familiar with those sorts of resources. There are health home programs, so you can get a medical care manager to help you in those instances if you have Medicaid. And Marcia, definitely let me know if I'm missing anything.
No, yes, you're on the right path.
Perfect. And then, or like connecting to your senior centers, some of them have the ability to access different types of benefits, mostly concrete resources, but I think they're also there to help support community members when it comes to, getting engaged in your healthcare system and navigating the healthcare system. So those are the ways that I know of. I think if you go on like Psychology Today to find a social worker, they're going to do mostly more counseling services, but of course, I'm a social worker that does holistic care. So hopefully they would also, if you needed something, and your counseling sessions would help connect to those types of resources too. But that's kind of, I hope that answered the question. Those are a few ways that I know of for people to get connected, but I'm sure there might be other ways too.
And if you know somebody who has Medicaid, as you said, and needs health home, we do have that service. I can find social workers on the marketplace, just as this thing, any providers, any kind of medical provider, we have that access as well. So yes, we have that opportunity to assist.
And the last thing, if I could just, I realized I wanted to just mention that sometimes I know that people come to see me for like a once a year visit because maybe they live an hour and a half away from where I'm based, and they might have a local neurologist that is available to them to answer questions or to see on a more frequent basis, or if there's an emergency, and then they come to see a specialist on a once-a-year basis just to kind of get a tune-up, sort of along the same lines as the model that Lori was discussing in terms of this consultative process. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways to create your care team, as we've kind of been discussing over the last couple of days. And so I would also encourage you to be aware of virtual services. I know not everyone is comfortable with you know, doing telemedicine, but it's an option if it's also something that, particularly for those that live in rural communities in New York, that might be interested in seeing someone that's at a specialist center, that they could do a telemedicine visit. And at least for movement disorders, we find that we're able to accomplish a lot over video and able to really do a comprehensive assessment. I know that some people worry that without seeing me, how can you, you know, figure out what's really going on with me? But there's a lot that can be done. So any other questions? So I wanted to do a belated good evening, because I came in a little bit late, but thank you all again for joining us. And I think we're just going to move on to the next session, where I think Chelsea and Liz will be taking the lead, and I'll add in, but we were just going to talk about, you know, what does compassionate and personalized care really look like for an individual with Parkinson's disease? And I think we'll let Chelsea kind of start off the conversation, and please feel free to ask questions or interject via the chat.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think we can load the whole slide if that's possible. Thank you so much. So yes, compassionate and personalized care. Essentially, we would like to have an organized day with variable activities, and what that can mean. And I'm going to discuss some case studies for you all, just to explain what exactly that does mean. But these variable activities can mean a bunch of things. We don't want to necessarily have a routine day that's sticking one thing after another, but that variability actually helps improve cognitive function and how our brain is thinking, how our body is moving. And that variability is actually linked to these brain changes. That's very helpful for creating this rich environment that we would like for our individuals with Parkinson's. So that's very important. And you'll see that in our case studies that I'll be bringing up in a few moments. Also, like I just mentioned, cognitive and physical engagement. So making sure that our brain is active just as much as our body is active. And if we can, combining the two of those things together. Making sure that the activities that we're doing are tailored to the interests of the individual. So it's so important that we're doing things that interest us. No one wants to do anything that really isn't of interest. So if I were to say, you have to get on the treadmill, and you, for example, really hate the treadmill, that's not going to be fun, and you're going to learn to hate that activity. And so instead, we really want to do something that sparks joy in your life. And if you, for example, really like to golf, or if you find, I don't know, painting really exciting, that's something that we will find a way to engage you in, whether that be cognitively, whether that be physically. Even in the painting example, we can have you standing at a painting easel and be working on balance at the same time. There are things that we can be doing, and we can be working with you to accomplish these tasks and be doing it in a very creative way. Also, we want to make sure that you are doing what you enjoy doing. And even if it's something that you feel you were doing in the past and you feel, I need to put that to rest, it doesn't mean that it has to be to rest. That's something that we can actually bring back, and you can still be engaging in. Just because maybe something that's going forward with your Parkinson's is prohibiting you from engaging in whatever that happens to be, you can work with your allied health professionals. That means speech therapists, physical therapists, as well as occupational therapists, and we can help bring that joy and bring that back into your life. And that's so important. So let's actually talk about a case study. I have here a participant, which I'm just going to sort of talk through. Their name is Mr. S. And so this is a retired gentleman that is 70 years old. They live at home with their significant other. And so his typical daily routine, and this is someone that is enjoying his life. He's really engaging in a lot of things. And so you'll see that in what he's doing. So he typically gets up at the same time every day, which is important actually for sleep health. And you're going to hear about that in a bit. But he gets up at the same time every morning, has his breakfast. He takes his morning medications, waits about 30 minutes to an hour before he goes out on his morning walk with his wife. And so that morning walk, they actually carry a little, I guess like a little record player between the two of them. I don't know what it's called, but they clip it onto one of their pants, and it plays music. And that's actually something that helps walking and helps the fluidity of walking in people with Parkinson's, sort of this outside view, and that you can actually link on to the beat of walking, and it makes walking become a little bit of an easier task. And so he actually will walk to the beat of music, and they do that for 30 minutes in the morning. They'll come back inside. They both do their word search puzzles. They'll do some household chores, which I don't think many people like, but it is a necessary job. So they'll do that. And then in the afternoons, they'll often go to community events for social engagement. And so that's where they're getting out, they're socializing, which is so important. And of course, during the COVID pandemic, that was lessened. And so we had to find different ways to address how do we socialize during that period. And so ways that we were doing that, we're actually linking up with groups, Parkinson's groups online. And so we were having these socialization groups and different activities through these Parkinson's related groups. So they were getting that socialization through that venue. Then as we get into the afternoon periods, Mr. S actually goes and does a second workout, if you can believe it. And that workout can be a multitude of different things. And so he actually has a list of different things. He chooses which one he'd like to do that day, because that choice is really impactful. Because remember, like I said, we want to choose what we want to do on that day, because that meaningfulness that is really important for brain health. And so he has a list of whether it be boxing, whether it be Tai Chi, fencing. I know nothing about fencing, but he was a fencer in his past. Some balance activities, and then he'll wrap it up by playing with some of the grandkids a few days a week. And so we're talking about engaging the grandkids in some of his tasks, and by doing things like a ball toss, and if we could get the ball toss and engaging in a brain games test. And so every time you would pass the ball back and forth, you would have to name something in a category, for example. And that category could be like, name a different sport, name a winter sport or something like that. And so you'd pass the ball and be like skiing, or you'd pass the ball and say skating, something to that nature. But it's activating the brain while you're still engaging in a physical task. And so that's very cognitively stimulating, and it's helpful for brain health. And then beyond that, they'll wrap up the end of the day with reading a good book before bed, talk about that book chapter, because both him and his wife read the same book. And so that's another sort of cognitive bringing it all together, and they get to talk about that. That's a socialization, bringing it all together. So you can see there's a really jam-packed day, and this is just a typical weekday for this individual. And it's a lot to deal with. But the other thing too is that even on the weekends, they're up, they're moving around. But the one thing I want to say is that we talked about this too, that even though there is these jam-packed days, we also want to be listening to our bodies, because sometimes you're going to wake up and you're like, oh, I'm feeling really tired today. And so listening to your body and understanding that today I'm just going to have an active rest day. Doesn't mean that I'm going to be necessarily sitting on the couch and taking it as a full out rest day, spa day, but just maybe taking it a notch down or two, and just really listening to what my body has to say, because that's an important piece, and that can decrease your risk of potentially falling in the future. We don't want that to happen. And so on those days, perhaps he does a stationary bike, for example, if that's available, a pedaling machine or something like that, just to sort of keep up and moving around. And they try to, on those days, get up and move pretty much every single hour. Now, that's Mr. S, a vibrant individual, just getting up, moving around all the time. But what does this sort of not necessarily personalized care look like, and what does it mean to not be moving around? Well, let me give you a case study of an individual that I met early in his journey. This is a young individual with Parkinson's, works full-time as a software engineer, and they are a single parent, has 2 young kids at home, no significant other in the picture, unfortunately. And so he runs his own business, and so that requires a lot of sitting time. And so with that being said, he doesn't get up and move a lot because there's a lot of demands because of his business. And the only times that he's getting up to move are to drop the kids off at school, and then pick them up again, and then maybe make them their meals for the night, make sure that they're tucked in bed and everything like that. And so when I first met him, he felt absolutely exhausted. And he felt that he was just sort of running through the day and couldn't keep up with anything. And that he didn't really have the support that he needed. And so part of our role in the allied health world was to sort of spark that joy back in his life, and also consider ways in which we could start to infiltrate some things that he could be doing that could be better for his cognitive health, as well as for his movement and his physical activity. And so even some simple sort of cues, something like getting up and moving just for 2 minutes every hour, or even every other hour, is something that it's a starting point. And that can be really helpful. Another thing is that we had a long discussion about what is something that, if you had nothing on the plate, if you had a full day that was open, what would be something that you would immediately do? And that would be something that would be interesting to you. And he said, I'd like to go to the beach. And so we figured out something like that to incorporate the kids going to the beach on the day or on the weekend. And so just trying to figure out whatever it is that really sparks joy in that person's life, and making sure that it's something that is active, you're getting out of the house, you're socializing. We also put that individual in, we linked them up with a community group so that he was able to talk to individuals that were just like him. That it's so powerful to be able to talk to individuals that are in the same situation that you're in. And actually, we were talking about that individual today, and we found another person that's just in the same situation. And so we linked the 2 of them up. So it's really important, and I can't stress this enough, to make sure that you're getting up, you're moving, you're socializing in your community, whether that be within your local community, but also within the community of Parkinson's, because that can be incredibly valuable for you, and you can actually learn some tips and tricks. But that's essentially sort of what I would say is more so this compassionate and personalized care. And especially from the allied health standpoint, we can really individualize your care and really excel that for you.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. That was awesome. I think you really painted the picture of what it looks like from a bird's eye view when you're kind of looking at the day-to-day for a person with Parkinson's, and recognizing that care partners are often the ones that help to shape this day. And that I wanted to kind of touch on these next 2 questions, but the overarching thought of there can be challenges as a care partner or allied healthcare professional to encouraging someone with Parkinson's to have a day like this, as Chelsea described it. I think, and in particular, we've talked about some of these challenges in the non-motor section, but specifically, I'm thinking about 3 symptoms that can get in the way. One is apathy, the second is depression, and the third is fatigue. So I think sometimes because people with Parkinson's do have these non-motor symptoms that you can't see, it makes it challenging for someone who's a caregiver, a care partner, to understand why they may not be willing to do these things that would help them feel better. And I can't tell you, I've heard it time and time again that, well, they just want to sit, the person with Parkinson's wants to just sit all day. They want to sit on the couch and they don't want to do anything. They don't seem interested. They don't seem engaged. They're very tired. And so I think for the care partner, it's hard to encourage that individual to get moving, to get engaged in these types of things. And I think it actually can cause some problems and difficulties. So I just want to be sure that everyone on this call, the participants, are aware of these symptoms and that they can serve as barriers. So just as a reminder, apathy is again that symptom that's a part of Parkinson's that causes a lack of interest. So the person becomes more of a wallflower. They may be more likely to sit and be a passive participant and not be wanting to create an initiative. So creating a routine and structure can be really helpful. But sometimes even that the person may be resistant to. And I remember a care partner that told me, I find it exhausting to always be making all of the decisions, to tell them, well, why don't we do this now? Why don't we do that? And again, we have to be creative and think outside of the box. So in that situation, I suggested, well, why don't you create a set of dice and each number stands for a different activity, or they were having trouble with meal planning and say, well, if it's a number 1 that they roll, then that means it's chicken for dinner. And if it's a number 2, that means it's salmon, so that the care partner doesn't feel like all the decision-making is put on them. I had another patient who had apathy, and the care providers, unfortunately, would ask them, well, do you need to go to the bathroom? And he would say, no. Well, do you need to do this? Are you hungry? And they would say no. And so then I think the caregivers didn't recognize that this person was not able to express their needs and that they needed to step in and take them to the bathroom, even if it wasn't expressed, or give a meal or provide a snack. And so it's important to recognize that sometimes the individual with Parkinson's, because of apathy, may not express their needs. Similarly, if they're depressed, they may just not feel joy in what's going on. And if that's the case, that's something one needs to bring to the attention of the neurologist or the other providers. And if they're extremely tired because they're not sleeping, that's something I'll talk on. But I wanted to ask Elizabeth at this point, because I had a patient who unfortunately, was in this situation where there was a very loving wife, but he was very apathetic, and the only way she could get him going was by yelling and saying, let's go, and pulling him off of his feet to get him to walk. And I think the caregiver, who it was their first day in the home as a home health aide, was worried for the safety of the person with Parkinson's and actually called social services because they were concerned about their safety. So I think we wanted to touch on this and explain, when is it really appropriate and when you might observe some out of the ordinary behaviors, which may be our coping strategies that family members or other loved ones are using. So I'll let Liz take it from here.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Shah. And I think this kind of goes hand in hand with making sure we're not taking a cookie cutter approach, right? Because if we're just cycling patients through the office, we might not recognize or we might ignore some of these red flags when there's concern for patient safety. So I will say, the criteria that New York City has for referral to their program is that there is some sort of physical or mental impairment and that the person is in need of protection from actual or threatened harm due to inability to meet their needs, or protect them from abuse or financial exploitation. So that second piece is super important, because if someone does have cognitive issues and they're declining, it's important to make sure that we're also safe, guarding them from any sort of exploitation, and making sure that they're set with different types of power of attorney, and maybe thinking preemptively to set those things in place before the cognitive impairment comes to such a point where they can't make decisions on their own. So kind of the red flags that I look for, and I think that we should all be aware of when we see our patients, and I think we recognize these red flags as we ask more questions, and we want to make sure that we have an idea of what the home life is for this person. We want to look out for their living conditions. If there are frequent falls, and I mean like very frequent, and they're saying they're tripping over things, well, is there clutter in the home? Is it not livable in terms of hoarding, or is there some sort of, if it's not clean? I definitely have had that situation arise before, especially when we're talking about individuals who don't necessarily have a designated care partner, or it's just their aide that comes in every so often. And they're not mobile enough to kind of move around the home to take care of their environment. That can certainly become an issue, and we want to look out for that. And then in terms of emotional or physical abuse, when we ask questions pertinent to that, I think it's important that we pull the person with Parkinson's or the patient that we're concerned about away and give them time and space to disclose anything. Because certainly if they're in the vicinity or in the area of the person that is maybe emotionally or physically abusive towards them, they certainly won't feel comfortable speaking up about it with that person around. So if you suspect something, I would encourage you to pull that person and have some one-on-one time with them to ask these sorts of questions. So in the instance that Dr. Shah mentioned, if the aide does come to the appointments, then maybe asking the aide to step out and ask the patient some questions about what's been going on. You also do want to take notice of how the patient is arriving, or the client, depending on what agency you work at, how they're arriving to your office. Are they sort of looking unkempt? Do they look malnourished? Do they have trouble getting food or making food for themselves? Exploring these situations, providing resources for them. But if you feel that it's in a situation where there are immediate threats to their safety, then those are times in which I would report to Adult Protective Services to make sure that they are connected immediately to the resources that they need to be safe. So I always say, if there is a gut feeling and you have evidence, then certainly report that. It's not necessarily, it's your job to report it, but it's not necessarily your job to go around digging and trying to find all the evidence, especially if we don't have authority to go do home visits and things like that. That would be Adult Protective Services' job, to go into the home and investigate further and make sure that if there is something going on, they can interfere and connect the patient to resources immediately. You can also report anonymously. I always mention that too. I tend to try to let the patient know that I am concerned for them, that I would be making a report so that they're aware as well. That's, I think, what I'll speak to in terms of social services and Adult Protective Services, but I think it is important and goes well with this theme of this slide here, because if we do take a more individual and compassionate approach, we'll take the time to ask those questions and recognize those signs that can then lead to an immediate reporting or immediate connection to services.
Thanks so much, Liz. So I saw a question in the chat about sleep and issues with sleep. So I know I didn't get much time to spend discussing this, but certainly sleep dysregulation can contribute to someone's overall day. So I have many patients who either spend most of their day sleeping and they're not sleeping at night, which can be a real challenge for care partners, and particularly home health aides or folks that are trying to straddle that, being a caregiver and still working, and then having, mom or aunt up all night because they've been sleeping all day. So first of all, I think that as we age, there can be some changes that happen to one's regular sleep cycle. It does tend to be that people have a tendency to fall asleep more easily and have excess daytime sleepiness, particularly if they're not engaged and if they're idle. So falling asleep while watching television, falling asleep while just sitting on the couch and listening to a conversation. And this in itself is not necessarily alarming, but I think if that's coupled with, a lack of sleep at night or a feeling of constant fatigue, it can signal that someone's sleep is inadequate. Also, if someone though has always slept 4 or 5 hours a day, and now they're older and maybe they're sleeping a little bit less, I think it's important to kind of have appropriate expectations of what is quote unquote normal for sleep. So I think some people say, well, they're not sleeping 8 hours a night. And so this 8 hours, I think it was kind of created based on some studies, but each person's sleep requirement is a little bit different. Some people need 6 hours, some people need 9 hours. I think what I would look more to is if the person feels well rested in the morning. In terms of the medical things that I always think about when someone tells me that they're having, issues with their energy level or trouble with sleep is, first of all, is there a sleep disorder? So it's very common for people with Parkinson's disease to have obstructive sleep apnea. That is a condition where someone has multiple, what we call microarousals, meaning they kind of wake up briefly because the brain isn't getting enough oxygen. And it can often be a result of a collapse of the soft tissues in the back of the throat. So it produces a lot of snoring. So some of the signs of this is if someone complains of headaches when they wake up, dry mouth, and that they snore a lot. And sometimes the care partner might even observe them to stop breathing for brief moments. So I would definitely bring that to the attention of your provider, your medical provider. Sleep apnea is very common, and it can be diagnosed by doing an at-home or in-hospital sleep study. In addition, I think I briefly touched on the fact that there can be a variety of sleep disorders that accompany people with Parkinson's disease, including interrupted sleep, where people have fragmented sleep. They wake up frequently. Sometimes people wake up to go to the bathroom. Sometimes they have what's called REM sleep behavior disorder, where they act out their dreams and talk in their sleep and punch or kick. And so all of those situations are going to lead to a poor quality of sleep and a feeling of fatigue or sleepiness when you wake up in the morning. So those all can also be addressed with some adjustments. I also remind people about having good sleep hygiene. So, I have a young infant, and now I'm reminded of this all the time, that I had to teach her how to sleep. And I think we as adults often forget. So I know I've done it too. I watch Netflix until late at night, or maybe I'll have a glass of wine with dinner or have a late evening caffeinated beverage. And then I lay in bed and I can't fall asleep. So good sleep habits are really important to setting the stage for a good night's rest. So that means no TV in the evening. Our brains have two systems that help us to regulate our sleep: our sympathetic nervous system, which kind of gets us going, and our parasympathetic nervous system, which calms us down. And if we're doing activities, a lot of exciting activities or watching TV, that wakes up our sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system just can't get in there to calm us down. So it's important to kind of start to regulate one's sleep schedule by calming down in the evening hours, avoiding caffeine, avoiding television or looking at one's phone. And if you insist and you have to look at your phone, I would say at least dim the screen, or so that it cancels out the blue, which really wakes up our brains. You might even try some sleepy time tea or a warm glass of milk. It really does create some of those hormonal changes in our brains that signal it's time to sleep. Melatonin is a very safe over-the-counter supplement that's naturally produced by our brains, and sometimes we need a little extra melatonin. I would say start with a low dose, like 3 milligrams, and it's very safe to take up to 12 milligrams, and it might help you fall asleep. Then make sure your room or your sleeping environment is calm and quiet. Even a white noise machine can be helpful, particularly for those of us that are living in the city where there might be a lot of noises that wake us up. The room is cool and dark, and that the room where you sleep should ideally be reserved for just sleeping and not reading and doing work and sitting on the bed with a laptop, so that our brains learn to associate that environment with sleeping. And then hopefully that helps you fall asleep. If you do get up at night, I always tell my patients, you know, the worst thing you can do is lay in bed and just toss and turn worrying about how many hours are left before you can fall back asleep. So get out of bed, grab a book, a paper book or a magazine, something boring, maybe something from the Parkinson's Foundation, and read. And that will hopefully put you to sleep and get you back into bed. If all of that doesn't work, of course, talk to your doctor. And then what you do during the day also has a really important role. So I think what Chelsea pointed out, all these various cognitive and physical activities are really important, getting outside and seeing the sun. So I know particularly as people get older and if they have cognitive issues, you know, they're not seeing the sun, the brain gets confused and flips day and night. So keeping the windows open, fresh air, sunlight during the day, being active as much as is possible will also help to kind of get out some of that extra nervous energy so that one is tired to fall asleep. If you do take a nap or if your loved one wants to take a nap, I would say just limit it to 45 minutes or so, nothing more than an hour, and try to avoid napping after 5 o'clock. And I would also just try to keep an eye on when the caffeine is going in. So if you're going to have a cup of coffee or even two, I think some people with Parkinson's actually benefit from having a cup of coffee in the morning and in the afternoon. There's some good evidence to suggest that that's energizing. I would avoid any caffeine after about 3 p.m. So those are just some simple tips about how one can regulate one's sleep cycle. But, you know, even after all of that, I do have patients who go to bed at like midnight and wake up at 5 and they feel energized. And I think as long as it's not interfering with their life, I wouldn't stress too much about getting someone to sleep from 10 to 6 and getting that 8 hours. So I hope all of that makes sense. I'm just going to take a quick peek at the chat. So Ms. Hay said that my mom does not sleep at night. She's tried several medications, still trying to regulate with medications, not working. So that is a tough situation. And I think sometimes, you know, one medicine may not work, a second might, sometimes we have to use them in combination. I would also say that it's important to treat any depression that might be present. So because depression itself interferes with the sleep cycle. And sometimes people wake up because they're feeling anxious or worried, especially early morning waking. But I would then try to increase the daytime activities so that she would get more tired at night. And I would just, you know, do some simple taking a look at what is she eating? What is she drinking? Is it that she's drinking too much water and that's waking her up at night? Maybe you have to go to the bathroom and that wakes her up. Maybe it's there's too much caffeine. Maybe it's that she's not getting enough physical activity. But it is a bit of trial and error, like everything we've kind of talked about in problem solving. But I hope that your team is working with you and together. And if you want, we can have a separate conversation offline about her medicines and maybe I can make a suggestion. Any other questions? So I think that we'll move on to the next section, maybe after a brief break. So following the break, we're going to have a talk from Liz and Chelsea about care partner needs. This is going to go into some more additional details about how to navigate transitions in care, different care partners' needs at different points in the stages of Parkinson's, early, mid, and late. And then we were going to have, you know, we were looking for cases. I don't think we've gotten any, but in that case, we could have a discussion, I think, with our care partners and people with Parkinson's who are here today, whoever's available and interested. And maybe we could just have an informal conversation. And if we are finished with that, we can even finish early because we've been, you know, keeping you all till 8:00. So why don't we all take a break and reconvene at 7:10. Thanks so much. Okay, so I see we have a really prompt panel group that's back. So Elizabeth and Chelsea were going to share kind of some of their tips and thoughts about care partner needs. So you guys let me know if you want me to advance the slides or leave it as is.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I think I'll ask you to advance as I go through everything so there's not just a bunch of text at once. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit along with Chelsea about what the different care partner needs and what sort of challenges you might find throughout the different stages of Parkinson's, and then kind of maybe some resources to help or coping skills and strategies to help with each challenge. So Dr. Shah, if you could advance. So in the early stages, so initially what's going to happen is the person with Parkinson's is going to receive their diagnosis. You as a care partner may or may not be there. You might get that information a little bit later, or you might be there at the visit with them. And certainly there are different responses or reactions that one might have to receiving the diagnosis of Parkinson's. And the caregiver or the care partner's response might be in line with the person with Parkinson's, or you might have totally different responses and reactions to that diagnosis. And what I like to say is that whatever reaction you have is your own, and that it's okay if it's different than your loved ones. But try to respect each other, and as you both process the diagnosis, give space to the emotions that one or the other is having. And there's definitely no right or wrong way to cope with such challenging news. And it might take some time to process that as well. I will say one of the first things that many, not everyone, because some people don't really want to know too much too soon, but a lot of people will turn to Dr. Google, as I like to call it, to get more information after their visit where they receive the diagnosis, to find out more about what is this disease, what does it mean for me, and what does it mean for my family. So I highly discourage just typing Parkinson's disease into Google. And I highly encourage that you go to reliable sources of information. The kind of big three that I usually point to that have a lot of good educational materials and resources would be Parkinson's Foundation, American Parkinson's Disease Association, and Michael J. Fox Foundation. I would definitely try to limit your intake of this information, especially when you just received the diagnosis. But if you do want to learn more about it, I would suggest going to one of these organizations' websites because they have a wealth of information. So then, you and the person with Parkinson's find out that they have Parkinson's, they get this diagnosis. And so we could go to the next bullet point. Is how do we disclose this diagnosis? Who do we tell? When's the right time to share this news with others? How do we do so? I say, as always, it's a partnership. What I tell our person with Parkinson's is that it is their diagnosis. And so it should be on their terms, how and when and who they disclose to. I certainly tell them to allow themselves some time to process it and learn a little bit more about it before disclosing. But again, this is a partnership. So I say as a care partner or caregiver that you work with your loved one or the person with Parkinson's to decide on a good time to disclose the information. I always say that there's definitely no rush, that you don't have to go home right after your visit and tell everyone that you know, to take your time and to be prepared to answer questions. Certainly if you're disclosing to family members or adult children, they might have a lot of questions, and it might be overwhelming if you don't have those answers. It's okay not to have the answers, but it just might be very overwhelming. So if you take some time first to learn about it before disclosing, you might be more prepared to answer some of those questions. A lot of these organizations, the Parkinson's Foundation, Michael J. Fox, I think Davis Finney Foundation, have a lot of good handouts and articles about disclosing to different groups of people. So they have articles about how to disclose to young children if you happen to have young children, family members, how to disclose to employers or friends. And I tell people, I warn them that people might have the reaction that you've expected, and some people might react not in the way that you would have liked or that you would have hoped for. and certainly to be prepared for that as much as you can be. But I think most times people will be surprised at how willing people are to help once they find out that you have that diagnosis. So the next bullet point. So I mentioned disclosing to employers. So if the person with Parkinson's is still working, what are the rights that you have as a person with what would be considered a disability? There is the Americans with Disability Act that makes it unlawful to discriminate in employment against a qualified individual with a disability. And this is, I'm quoting here, so nothing got lost in translation. If you have a disability, according to ADA, you must also be qualified to perform the essential functions or duties of a job with or without reasonable accommodation in order to be protected from job discrimination by the ADA. So therefore, an employer cannot refuse to hire you or terminate you because your disability prevents you from performing duties that are not essential to your job. So as long as you do the essential jobs, functions, and tasks, then you should be covered by the ADA. So if you want to disclose at work, I always talk to people about, I don't know your employer very well. You may have worked at this company that you're at for 15, 20 years. So I think you would know a little bit better how they might react, and you might be able to gauge how they may react to the disclosure of your diagnosis. You might know if your employer is going to be a little bit more lenient in terms of providing you with a lot of accommodations, if they're reasonable, and some might give you a harder time, although they must allow you that reasonable accommodation. And of course, the accommodation must be reasonable. So for example, working from home a few days, getting a standing desk if you cramp easily while you're sitting, voice to text capabilities if you're having difficulty typing or writing, providing frequent breaks. So I think this is important to keep in mind when you're asking for accommodations. And of course, the pro and con of disclosing at work is you might get unfavorable reactions. People might start treating you differently for the good, for better or for worse, which is unfortunate. But hopefully you would know what kind of environment your workplace is. But a pro of disclosing certainly would be that you can then ask for these accommodations to make your work life a little bit easier. And of course, if you disclose this and you're allowed accommodations, but then you feel like you were terminated immediately after disclosing and that there's something not quite right about the situation, I usually recommend consulting with a disability attorney. New York Legal Assistance Group that I mentioned before, I would definitely recommend reaching out to them. Unfortunately, I would say for the most part, people do get a good reaction from their workplace. They get accommodations, but unfortunately, there are those few moments where the employer is not the best, and we do need to get disability attorneys involved. They could certainly help you if you feel like something unlawful was done in regards to ADA. I do also want to mention Family Medical Leave Act. So this would give you 12 weeks of additional unpaid leave. And I want to mention that this is both for the person with Parkinson's, and if you're a care partner or a caregiver to that person with Parkinson's, you can also get this 12 weeks of additional unpaid leave. And this could allow you to, it could be taken intermittently or continuously. So if you as the caregiver or care partner are taking the person with Parkinson's to their appointments and you're missing work for that, or they have an off day, so you need to stay home to help them a little bit, you can take this additional leave time, which is in addition to any sick days you have, any vacation days you have, to do those things. So I just wanted to mention that that's important. And also, if you're currently working, just to be aware of your employer's disability benefits. Do they have short-term disability? Do they have long-term disability? It's just important to note those things so that if you do start to have a lot of difficulty with work, even with accommodations, and you're starting not to be able to perform those essential job functions, then I think it's important to note what benefits you're entitled to, and then apply for those at a time that you think is appropriate. But certainly if you're having trouble at work, asking for accommodations and then kind of evaluating how you're doing with those accommodations. And if you're not doing so well, then maybe thinking about going on disability. So then the next bullet point, just wanted to, I think, briefly touch upon, and there's the NILAG website. So that's the New York Legal Assistance Group. You can get, that's the same place where you can get assistance with benefits like Medicaid, but they also do assistance for disability benefits and ADA compliance. So definitely check that as a resource. And so, you know, in addition to receiving the diagnosis, you might feel a little bit more withdrawn, you might feel embarrassed, but I think it's really important that you socialize and remain as active as possible. I'm sure it's been repeated here, and we know now that exercise and physical activity is super important. You know, as you process the diagnosis, I'm sure it'll take some time to return back to your normal life, quote unquote normal life. And so we want to encourage you to do that. So, you know, getting in touch again with your senior centers or community centers, getting involved that way. Maybe joining a support group. I always say with caution as a newly diagnosed person. I leave it to your comfort level. I do advise that if you do look for a support group when you're early on in the disease process, to make sure you speak with the facilitator of the group you're interested in to gauge where people at in their disease process in that group, and see where your comfort level lies in there. But I think it could be important to make that connection so you not feel so isolated and alone, and knowing that there are others out there with this diagnosis too. The next bullet point. So creating a care team, which we certainly discussed thoroughly, I think, but that is important. I know on day one I spoke about how to create your care team, your medical care team, and your support network, and knowing who should be on that team and how to access and find those team members. But I think it's important early on in your disease process to build that care team. So I would say don't wait until you have severe gait or balance issues to find your physical therapist. Find them ahead of time, put them on your team. Even if it's just a consultation, they say you're doing great, let's find a good exercise regimen, check in if we every once in a while, and then you might start to use them more, but then you'll have a good thorough and developed relationship with that person so you can trust them. So building all of the people that you heard from throughout these last 3 nights, physical, occupational, speech therapy, making sure that you have those people identified early on in your disease process and not down the road.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, I was just going to mention too, that when you develop these relationships early, it can be really helpful because one, you're living with yourself every day. And when you check in every single year with all of your allied health, also with your neurologist, they might be catching things and they might be seeing things that perhaps you're not catching up on. And so they can just be nipping these things in the bud really quickly. And we see that a lot, especially in the PT world, but also, you know, in other realms of allied health as well. And we can quickly nip that in the bud and be able to sort of regress whatever that process is, whether it be with exercise, whether it be with any sort of like cognitive training or even with a medication. And so that can really help you out. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. We always like to catch things ahead of time before they come to a point where it's going to take a lot of effort to kind of redirect the ship. So thank you. Okay, so the next bullet point. So we're going to now talk a little bit about now mid to late stages that we're looking at. So what are some challenges that we might face in these stages of the disease process, and how can we address them? So I think Dr. Shah had mentioned depression and apathy, fatigue, and there's also anxiety that can certainly be there. So these different mood changes that can occur, they can also precede the diagnosis in terms of depression and anxiety, but certainly towards the mid to late stages, it could definitely be of some challenge to both the person with Parkinson's and care partners and caregivers and family. It's important to note that about 40 to 50% of people with Parkinson's do have depression and anxiety. So definitely trying to normalize that for this community, and that if you recognize signs and symptoms of depression or anxiety, to seek treatment or to disclose that to someone so you can get proper help. But certainly for depression, we want to look out for things like low energy, either a change in appetite, whether that be an increase or decrease, a sense of hopelessness if the person's very tearful, has like a down and depressed mood, low interest in doing things, which there's a little bit of overlap with apathy as well. We want to make sure that we note these changes in someone's mood and that we address them. And then in terms of apathy, which was mentioned by Dr. Shah, just a lack of interest in doing things, a lack of initiative in getting things going and participating in activities. One of the things that can be helpful for that is developing a routine and a schedule. So kind of developing this external locus of motivation so that, you know, it's on the schedule. And I find that people, in terms of physical activity, when they have physical therapy and they have those scheduled sessions, they're more likely to engage in them than if they're just kind of on their own and, you know, trying to think of day to day, what do they want to do that day? So it's more helpful to, what I say is to sit down with the person with Parkinson's and the care partner and think of some ideas one day, like maybe on a Sunday. What do we want to do this week? What do we like to do? What are your interests? And then scheduling out your week. That way, you know that you, and I think, you know, obviously Chelsea was talking about this in terms of when we do develop that schedule, how do we personalize it to the person with Parkinson's? So there is at least a little bit of interest in the activity that they're doing. But I think it's helpful to get it down on paper, on the calendar, have a timer, just to make sure that there's, you know, developing some sort of motivation outside of the person within themselves, because with apathy, it's going to be very hard to have that intrinsic locus of motivation. And for the depression and the anxiety, if it's very severe, then we definitely, even if it's not severe, if it's moderate or mild, but it's impacting the person's day-to-day function, we want to make sure that they get connected to proper behavioral health and psychiatric care. And it's important to note that medication, in addition to counseling, is definitely more effective than just maybe medication alone. So if you're seeing a psychiatrist and they're prescribing something, I still encourage people to talk to someone regularly, once a week, if it might be more or less, but to check in with someone, because I find with anxiety specifically as well, we might have these thoughts that go through our head that keep us up at night. And so we want to talk to someone and find ways that we can redirect or change those thought patterns for the better. So you do that in counseling, and the medication might help as well. And so the next bullet point. So in the mid to late stages, we'll also start thinking about advanced care planning, which I think should be normalized in any kind of healthcare setting. And I think everyone should at least think a little bit at some point about what are their wishes for their end of life care, and what would I like to be seen done for my end of life care. So everyone, I think, should have this done, because it makes it easier for your loved ones and your family to know what you would like to do, so that they don't have to make these decisions in an emergent situation without knowing what you'd like to do. So in terms of advanced care directives, you would prefer to see a healthcare proxy in place that can make some medical care decisions if you're unable to do that, or if the person with Parkinson's is unable to do that at some point. A power of attorney, if again, you know, in terms of financial activities, if the person's unable to do that at some point. And then living will. I think there's a website called 5wishes.org, which makes it very simple to list out what your wishes are for end of life. And I think the sooner we have this conversation, the better, because we don't know what life holds for any of us. So when we have these things, they're difficult conversations to have, but when you have them, you can definitely feel more prepared, both as the person with Parkinson's and your family and you as a care partner can know and feel more prepared about knowing what your loved one's wishes are. And also in terms of advanced care planning and advanced directives, I will say during mid to late stages, and we have recently begun a palliative care project with Parkinson's Foundation, that palliative care be introduced even early stage, but throughout the disease process, checking in with palliative care, making sure that we are having these conversations about goals of care discussion. And I believe we had palliative care discussion yesterday, which I wasn't here for, unfortunately, but I'm sure you learned a lot from Dr. Kluger as well about palliative care and how important it is to be introduced not just at end end of the disease process, but early on as well, can be very effective in making sure that we're having the best quality of life possible throughout every stage of this disease. And then in terms of, I think, along with this conversation about advanced care directives, talking about long-term care options, what is the person with Parkinson's open to in terms of, do they want to stay at home for as long as possible safely? Are they okay with facility-based care? You know, and what are the options for that? So going back to preparing for that financially, what does that look like? I think it's important to have those conversations, I would say mid-stage rather than late stage, when some of those things can be popping up in real time. So these are definitely, the advanced care planning are difficult conversations to have, and I don't want to make it seem like it's super easy, but I think they're conversations that when they're had, they could be very productive in making sure that everyone's wishes are known and that we have a set plan. And so instead of worrying about what tomorrow or 5 years brings, you kind of have a loose plan in place where you're always flexible with it, but you know that there's this plan in place that you have to make yourself feel more assured. And so then the next bullet point. So I think, again, throughout the disease process, but maybe more so in the mid to late stages, we really start to see this sense of ambiguous loss. So what that means is kind of a loss that occurs without closure or clear understanding. So, you know, in terms of identity, sometimes people feel like they're losing their identity, especially as a care partner or caregiver, but also as the person with Parkinson's. I like to say for spouses, you know, and if you start to feel like you're just the caregiver, what are ways that you can find new meaning of intimacy? Is it hand holding, cuddling, hugs, quality time with your loved one? What are ways that you can feel intimate outside of being a caregiver, but rather leaving that time for, I'm this person's spouse, and finding intimacy in that relationship. Another type of law, and I will say, well, in terms of identity, I think it's very easy, especially in the early stage, to get caught up in the Parkinson's community and going to support groups and educational programs and Parkinson's exercise classes. So it can start to feel, I think, has been said to me that they are Parkinson's, and it's then become their whole identity. But I think it's important that you still keep that sense of you, and same for the care partners. If they start attending all these meetings and things like that, I always applaud people for doing that, but I always say to take time for yourselves outside of the Parkinson's community, so you can still recognize those other senses and other parts of yourself and parts of your identity. So making sure you give time to those as well. Another type of loss, ambiguous loss, is a loss of function or independence. So you might find that you're having more difficulty doing things. You might need more help in doing things, which I think sometimes for the care partner can be difficult, because if someone wants to hold on to that independence, it's hard to help them because they would like to do things on their own. But we do need to recognize if there is this change in function, that we want to make sure that we're providing them independence, but in a safe manner. So with that, I think maintaining a flexible attitude is important, and making sure that we're trying to adapt to the person with Parkinson's capabilities, so that they could still do the things that they enjoy, and as most independently as they can, whether that be with assistive devices. And I think, again, going back to the care team, those people are there to help find ways for you to stay engaged in the things you like to do. Even if you lose a little bit of function or ability, or you're limited by some of your symptoms, we can find alternative solutions to make sure that you're still able to do the things that you enjoy to do. So what I always like to say is, if you like golfing and you used to do 18 holes, let's shoot for 9. You're still engaging in that activity you like to do, you're finding joy out of it, but you're not walking away feeling maybe a little bit defeated because you weren't able to do the 18. If you set a more realistic goal of 9 and you complete that, you'll feel more successful and accomplished. So I think the SMART goals, as have been mentioned, is important in terms of the loss of function and independence. We want to make sure that what you're planning to do and the activities you like to do are attainable and you're able to do them safely.
Yeah, and Liz, I just wanted to mention one more thing too. just making sure that we're having these, I mentioned this yesterday a little bit, but making sure that we're having an open dialogue about this, because it's a very difficult conversation to have. Like I said, we tend to always pride ourselves on our independence and our freedom of independence. And when that's threatened, or when that's being, there's a fear of having that stripped away from us, that's a big loss. And that can be something that's terrifying. And to ask someone for help can be a big ask. And so sometimes that's a very difficult thing to do. And so, you know, it's very difficult to sort of like wave that white flag and almost surrender that in a way. And so having this sort of deep discussion, and a lot of the time when I've had individuals come in to see me for therapy, you know, we've had this discussion and I've had to be a mediator, and, you know, it's okay to ask for help, but at the same time, we also understand, and it's having that acceptance. It's like, you know, acknowledging that this is something that's difficult for them, and hearing that they're saying that, and knowing that it doesn't necessarily always have to be that way, especially with allied health coming in, but just making sure that those lines of communication are always open, and understanding that, like, we want to bring that independence to you, and we want to make sure that you're as independent as possible within a realm of safety at the same time. And sometimes that from the care person standpoint, you know, a little bit of help can go a long way. And so there's like a little bit of a give and take relationship there. So,
yeah. I also think it's important sometimes when as the care partner or caregiver offering that help, to ask permission first to help, rather than just jumping in and doing something for someone. So if you notice someone struggling with someone, is it okay if I help you? Would you like me to help you? Rather than just going straight for it. It could be helpful too. But yeah, they definitely important points. It's certainly not easy when there's this, we all like to be independent people, and sometimes it's hard to accept that if we need a little bit of help. Okay, and then I think my last bullet point there. So as the disease progresses, we might see a little bit more cases of emergent situations, or where there's hospitalizations. And unfortunately, if that is the case, sometimes it might be that you've noticed if there is a hospitalization, that the person comes out maybe not so great, or a little worse than when they went in. And sometimes that can be if the treating team in the hospital isn't aware of the medication schedules, or they don't stick to it. If changes were made without knowledge of the movement disorder specialist, it could certainly affect the condition of the person with Parkinson's. So it's important to make the treating team in the inpatient setting aware that the person has Parkinson's and what that means. So the Parkinson's Foundation has created this Aware and Care Kit, which is free, and you could call the helpline to get this Aware and Care Kit. But it's essentially a grab and go kit. So if someone was hospitalized, you take this to the hospital with them, and it includes information for the hospital doctors to know in terms of what their medication regimen is, the schedule at which it should be taken, what medication should not be given to a person with Parkinson's and could have an adverse effect, contact information for your treating movement disorder specialist neurologist. If someone has DBS, or deep brain stimulation, that information could be included in this Aware and Care Kit. So it's just meant to make the hospitalization go a little bit more smoothly, and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what our person with Parkinson's needs while they're in the hospital. And hopefully that would, you know, produce a better outcome from the hospitalization and the admission. That was, I think, my last bullet point. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And Chelsea, if you have anything else to add, definitely feel free.
Yeah, no, Elizabeth, you did such a thorough job. So I don't know if I can add anything.
I think that was great. So I was thinking we could leave the slide up and invite our other panelists to share any comments. I know in particular, we had to rush through some of our care partner sessions with Mr. Coley and Mrs. Coley and Ms. Hay. And I know Mr. Smith is here with us as well, that, you know, perhaps they could share with us some of their comments on some of these points that Elizabeth touched on, as well as other information that maybe wasn't addressed that you feel is important for the participants to be aware of? And as our panel gathers their thoughts, oh, and Ms. Picardo is here too, great. If anyone has any questions or thoughts to share, please do so.
While we have a slide up, I want to emphasize the importance of the wear and care kit. Sometimes people put their medication in, they take pictures of the medication bottles if they don't have the bottles in there, and just take in the 7 days of the week in there, and really work with your care partner to be an advocate. We call some of the jobs of a partner in being a PITA in the hospital, for everybody who knows the acronyms for that, to be a pain in the derriere for people to make sure that people get their medication on time, because it's really important if something is missed and the patient's laying there not knowing what's going on. And this is a really important piece for the care partner when they're going to the hospital, and planning it out, talking about it, setting expectations. And it's extremely difficult right now in some places where the pandemic is still pretty heavy and no one can go in with the patient. And that's where the wear and care kit becomes even more vital.
Sure. I was going to add two things. First, around the issue that Denise was just talking about. We made it a family. We informed the entire family, not of the Parkinson's, but when one of our family members goes in the hospital, we try to make sure we have, if possible, around the clock, someone from the family there as an advocate. Not to criticize the hospital, but they get busy. There's things going on. They're not all, they want to be as attentive as they can, but they also have lots of demands on them. And so you need that care partner in place to help advocate for you. Because also you're not always conscious or in the mood to talk to the hospital staff if you're the patient, and your care partner can tell them more lucidly what's been going on, what's happening, what seems to be affecting you, as well as advocating for your medications to be done on time. And pushing the call button when they're not delivering the medications on time. That's absolutely critical. And then along this lines, I also want to again emphasize that the importance of communication between the care partner and the patient. I always tell people that whatever your relationship was with the patient before they got the diagnosis didn't go away with the diagnosis. And so if you had a strained communications a pattern with your loved one, or if in fact they were just subjects you didn't talk about before, it's better sooner than later to go address those and start to get those worked out, and not wait till the crisis to start figuring it out. And I often give the example of my dad, who my brothers and I, we all knew that my dad wasn't disclosing everything he should to his doctors. So I literally flew across the country the day he was getting his pre-op session for prostate cancer and met with the doctor. They were all surprised I didn't tell them in advance that I was coming. And lo and behold, the doctor started talking to me because they had already figured out that they weren't getting full disclosure, or what I now know from Parkinson's patients. All of a sudden they straighten up and fly right and walk perfectly and have no tremors when in front of the doctor. The moment they're outside, they're back to normal. So it's important that the care partner show up, be present, explain those things, and actually have the conversation, because the Parkinson's patients may have all kinds of communication challenges or holdbacks that are absolutely critical for them receiving the proper care when they're with their physicians or receiving treatment.
Another note that I would like to make on this is, recently I was the care partner and the Parkinson patient. And one of the things about being the care partner, I realized there are some things that are dual in any circumstance, which is having the medical information and symptom log on both myself and the person I'm the care partner for, because you never know whether or not the other person has it down. So when it came to dates and times, I usually keep things like that. So that's so important because they come in and ask right away, when did this happen? When did this happen? What did it happen here? So one or both people need to have it. And so since I've been on the care partner side, I've been very astutely aware of what to communicate with the doctor and make sure that they know what has happened in the past so they can make a more accurate diagnosis.
So, and I'll give you one other care partner tip. We not only know this, but we keep it written, because sometimes we had a situation where both of us were under care, and suddenly the other parts of the family have to show up and fulfill the roles that we did. And they haven't been thinking about this. They have jobs, they got all kinds of stuff going on. And it's really important if you can simply hand them the piece of paper and say, here it all is. Don't figure it out. Don't start, don't give me 64 questions while I'm laying there in the hospital bed with tubes coming out of my mouth. You want to ask me now? No, here it is. It's all written. So we keep an up-to-date list of things. So if we're ever both receiving care or in a challenging situation, we can hand this to one of our family members or whoever's there to assist and say, here it all is. It's right there in front of you. So if you have a question, look at this first. We hope that it's there. So my tip is that you take it very seriously to write this all down. It's great. Denise keeps a lot of stuff in her phone, but sometimes that's not so great when you have a third party there and they can't figure out your passwords and all that kind of stuff. But if you have it written and you have a piece of paper, which we take with us to the hospital, you can just hand it to them and you're much better off.
But with the telephone, we actually put it under the SOS with all the information with the doctors. So they can just push the button on the side of the phone and it all pops up for that moment.
I guess one of the things I wanted to say was, being that I was a caregiver for my mother, I stayed in the hospital with her. And when I stayed in the hospital with her, I was there almost every day. I used to spend the night. And then I would go home when my brother would come over and I would change my clothes, take a shower. And I'd go back and spend the night with her while she was in the hospital. But I learned a lot of things. I learned how to give her a bed bath. I had no idea how I was going to give her a bath. She had both legs amputated, so I couldn't put it in the tub. So they showed me how to do it. They showed me how to give her a bed bath, how to clean her, how to care for her, how when she needed to have a movement, how to clean her. And the weirdest thing was, it felt weird between my mother and I at the beginning. But once we got over that barrier, that she realized that I can do the job just as well as they can do the job. I can do more love than what they can do. We were fine. And she really wouldn't make anyone else change it but me. So I learned a lot by watching the staff in the hospital. One of the questions that I have, I didn't notice there was medication that a person with Parkinson's should not take. Because somebody asked me, what medication should I not be taking?
So I haven't seen actually that list. I should take a look at the list they have in the packet, but a few medications come to mind. So some are dopamine blocking medications, so antipsychotics, particularly sometimes when people go into the hospital and if they're elderly and have dementia, they may have confusion or hallucinations or develop what's called psychosis, where they see things or hear things that aren't there. And it can be a knee-jerk reaction by some providers to prescribe an antipsychotic. And I'll name a couple, like Risperdal or Abilify or Geodon or Zyprexa, olanzapine. These are all medicines that act by reducing the amount of dopamine in one's brain. And so you can imagine that if you're giving someone with Parkinson's who already has a lack of dopamine, these medicines can make it much worse. So there are some antipsychotics that one can take safely or more safely or have little risk of making one's Parkinson's worse. Those are atypical antipsychotics. So like Seroquel, or the generic name is quetiapine. So sometimes people that have Parkinson's and have hallucinations or behavioral symptoms, we can give Seroquel safely. So that's one of the medicine categories that comes to mind that I suspect is on that list of medicines to avoid.
Thank you.
They're also, we're all a little different. And so sometimes even medicines that are supposedly on the safe list can end up causing reactions. I've been in the hospital with Denise a number of times where she had a reaction, even though they were aware of all the other medications that she was taking and brought in an appropriate substitute, and she had a reaction. And it was important that I was there to let them know that that was happening and that that wasn't working out.
So Elizabeth is always ready, and she texted me the list that's in the packet. So the other medications, so some of these are medicines that a lot of people, I mentioned one of the categories of medicines people with Parkinson's take includes MAO-B inhibitors that blocks the degradation or the body's natural ability to chew up dopamine. And if you're on one of those MAO blockers and you take other medications that might act in that same pathway, it can cause a reaction. So one example is, for instance, there are some MAO-B inhibitors that are higher doses that are used as antidepressants. And people that take that medication can't eat, what's the word I'm looking for? A specific kind of cheese, like not smoked, but a fermented cheese, aged cheese, excuse me, because they can develop what's called a tyramine reaction. So some of these medicines that are on this list of medicines to avoid are that you avoid them if you're taking an MAO and B inhibitor, and those include pain medicines and anesthetics. So selegiline, I think I might have mentioned during my presentation that if you get a surgery, they often ask you to stop it for the 5 days before, because that can react with a lot of anesthetics that are used. And in addition, another one of those medicines that blocks dopamine is Reglan, metoclopramide. So it's actually an anti-nausea medicine. So sometimes, you know, people go to the hospital just with vomiting or GI upset or maybe a migraine, and they might be treated with Reglan because that's a common medicine to use, but people with Parkinson's can develop a reaction. So those are some examples. But as Mr. Coley so correctly pointed out, you know, each person is different. And so it's always important that's why it's so critical that we always have a list of medications so that you know what's up to date, because things may have changed and people have lists, especially now with electronic medical records. Often any prescription that you were ever sent, even if you never took it, is in the system. And sometimes doctors make assumptions and they see this list and they assume, because they don't have to take the time to ask you, are you taking this and this and this? They assume everything that's in the system you're either taking, and maybe if someone else prescribed it and it wasn't entered into the electronic record, they're not aware. And so they may not recognize a potential reaction. So always good to have an accurate list of medications.
Another thing that I say for the care partners, being an advocate is so important, because even if you go into the hospital and you get the full list of medications that you take, it's the changing of the shifts. And sometimes you get caught and people haven't read everything and they might be doing something. So more often than not, either one of us who might be in the hospital will stop them and saying, what is it that you're giving? And what was the last time I have noted was X amount of time. So is it really time, or is it too late? And then have you looked at the change that you made and whether or not it will react to all the other medications that one of us might have to take in the hospital?
So if, Mrs. Picardo, I just wanted to pick on you and see if there were any other comments or pearls of wisdom you could share with the group.
Thank you. Good evening. I just want to echo what Mr. Collis said about writing down information. And because we are in our circle of support, we have other members of the family who play the role of caregivers. And sometimes when we are in an emergency situation, there is another member of the family who is going to take care of the situation. But I want to encourage you, get a notebook, not just a piece of paper. Get a notebook where you have all the information, medication that is, if you stop taking a medication and start with a new one, you cross over and you will know who, when another member of your family is going to take care of you, have all the information in one book. Keep to help you to relieve a little bit of the stress for the caregiver is very important, the organization, be organized. So I want to encourage you also have a calendar, a big calendar, because we are visual learners and our caregivers are visual learners, and the people who is going to support us and help us in any moment, they need to find all the information quickly. And like I showed you yesterday, my favorite pen with 4 different colors. So you can organize your time, and that gives you a little relief of stress. You don't have to be living in stress 24 hours a day, because you are going to have handy the information, what is coming up tomorrow, where are you going to be next week, and all your information, every single information is going to be here if the caregiver have an emergency and your loved one need to be in the hospital with somebody else supporting her, to advocating for her. Always remember when you have to go to see the doctor, because when we are a patient, it's stressful. Doctor will take the time to explain us and talk us about it, but we're stressful or we're depressed, we don't pay attention. We really don't understand what the doctor tried to tell us or what the providers is telling us to support our have a better style of life. But it's always a good idea have somebody else with you when you visit the doctor, and write it down, all your questions, all the questions that you have, all the new signs and symptoms that you start feeling since the last time you see your doctor. That is what I like to add to this conversation. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
Let me make one more comment, because I think this is another critical thing that I've learned as care partner. In advance, you should think about your role when you go to hospital from one more perspective, and that is that your attitude and how you handle yourself at the hospital can make a huge amount of difference in the care that your loved one receives. And by that, I mean, I've been in hospital situations, listen to people almost screaming at the nurses or screaming at the doctors who were not the patient, but people caring for them. And you know, people are human. And so this is not a good way of interfacing with them if you expect them to provide you great service. So you need to, don't wait till you get in this stressful situation. I think that was a good way of describing. It's always a stressful situation. Prepare in advance. And I want to emphasize what every professional here said today. The better prepared you are, the more likely you're going to be able to handle the situation in a reasonably calm manner, which will in the end result in your loved one getting far better support within the hospital. Be empathetic to what the staff is going through. You know 10 times more about Parkinson's disease and your loved one than those who are trying to provide the care. Be cognizant of the fact that they're caring for many, many people, and you're in, and although they don't want to treat you as just a number, they also have buzzers going off down the hall, the whole bit. So your attitude goes a long, long way. And if you can prepare yourself mentally before you get in these crisis situations, to remain calm, to know you have all the proper paperwork, the notebook, the information, etc., it will help immensely both for you and your mental health and for the treatment that your loved one receives while they're there.
Such useful and great advice. So it's 8 o'clock again. I don't know how the time flies, but I'm just looking and I see that all of our participants, they've hung in there and you're staying and listening till the end. So we really appreciate your participation, and we hope that this has been a really useful and informative 3 days. I hope that you've learned some tips and practical things you can do on a day-to-day basis to really allow the person with Parkinson's to live well and thrive. I hope you see that there's a variety of solutions that can be employed, that there's not just a one size fits all, and that there's a whole group of teams out there that are here to support you. So we just encourage you to take some of this information home with you. We hope that it's useful. Share it with those that you think might benefit. And should you have any questions, please feel free to email us. You should have access to the Neuro Rehab Lab email, which was one of the ways that you could have registered. Check out the Eventbrite, where we'll have posted the videos for all 3 days if you happen to have missed a session or wanted to catch up back on some information. We'll have the links available as well to all of the informational packets and resources. Someone on the chat asked how long the videos will be available, but they'll be emailed out to you. I'm not sure how long the Eventbrite invitation stays active once an event is over, but we'll be sure to email it to you so you can have that. And we plan to post that on the websites of the Neuro Rehab Lab, as well as the Movement Disorders Division. So thank you to, again, a really deep, heartfelt thanks to all of the panelists who have agreed and participated both tonight and the last 2 nights. We couldn't have done this without you. I know that it was a lot of work and coordination and overcoming some technical challenges at times. So we appreciate your patience and commitment. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. And I'm really appreciative of all of your efforts. I wanted to ask Dr. Quinn to also share some of her closing remarks.
Yes, I just also would like to thank everyone for, I just found the conversations and the case studies in particular to be just incredibly moving and helpful. And I really appreciated the range of opinions. I really learned a lot. I think that really speaks to so many things. It's just how, we've all been involved in this for a long time. A lot of the medical professionals and we are still learning. And I really appreciated learning from all of you and from the questions. So thank you for all of your participation. And I'll just also say a big shout out to Danielle Kipnis, who really helped to organize this entire event, and to Alyssa and to Chelsea, who were also really integral to it. So thank you all, and to everyone who's been on. So we will try to keep this alive and breathing and living through our websites and through additional talks that we'll be giving. So we'll be sure to be reaching out to all of you. So thank you again.
And so with that, I'll say good night and have a restful weekend, and you'll hear from us soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.